All right, so here we got deer and pine seedlings. Interesting. The suburban gardeners know deer will eat almost anything green. In a study of pine seedlings at an environmental center in Ohio, researchers noticed how deer damage varied with how much of the seedling was covered by thorny undergrowth. All right, so here we go. Here's our data. So here we have whether or not there is damage. So yes, in this column. So yes, no. Now in this column here, it shows what proportion of the the area that the pine seedlings was covered with had thorny coverage. So either was not covered at all, less than a third of it was covered, 1/3 of 2/3, and more than 2/3 of it was covered with had a thorny cover. All right, so what's the probability that a randomly selected seedling was damaged by deer? Okay, so for this, we're simply looking at the proportion of yes out of the total number of everything, out of total everything. So all of these values added up. So we have to figure out the overall total. So a good thing, especially when or a smart thing to do whenever you have a table without totals, already calculated for you, is just figure it out on your own first. So I'm going to add all these, which I already did, and so all these values add up to 2 and 9. These values add up to 662. These ones across, 16 is 151, 211. These two values, 234, 221, and then 205. And the overall, the total is 871, 871. Zoom in, that's a little easier to see, so 871. Okay, so it's asking simply what's the probability that if you selected at random a seedling, what's the probability that it was damaged by deer? So just overall. So the overall number of seedlings that were damaged by deer is 209. So this is just going to be 209 over the overall total, over 871. And we can simply use our calculator, and that'll be about 24%, 0.24. Now, part B. What are the conditional probabilities that a randomly selected seedling was damaged, given each level of cover? Okay, so conditional probabilities. So let's break down what that means in this problem. So the conditional probabilities are, these four values, or four factors, or think of four different setups. So either there was no thorny cover, either there was less than a third of it covered with thorny cover, 1/3 to 2/3, or more than 2/3. So these are the conditions. So like using this first, going across this first row, if we want to look at the first condition, you can ask like, what's the probability that there is deer damage? So we can say, what's the probability that there is deer damage? So let's say, what's the probability of yes, there is deer damage given that there was no thorny cover, given that none of it was covered in thorny cover. And the next one would be, what's the probability that there is deer damage? So what's the probability of yes, given that less than a third was covered in thorny cover? And you just keep going across. What's the probability that there was thorny covers, or there was the deer damage? What's the probability of yes, given that a third to 1/3 of the seedling was covered with thorny cover? So 1/3 to 2/3. And your fourth conditional probability is, what's the probability of yes, there being deer damage, given that more than a third had thorny cover, greater than 2/3. So these are your four conditional probabilities, and we can just calculate each of these. So What you simply do is, for the first one, we only care about the values in this first row. So what's the probability of yes out of this total row? So in this total, there's 211. So the probability of yes is 60 over 211. And that comes out to be about 0.28. The next row, what's the probability of yes? There's a probability of yes out of the total in this row. So it's basically just 76 out of 234 because there's a total of 76 yeses out of the 234. So this will be 76 out of 234. And that'll be about 0.32. The next one will be the third row, the number of yeses, 44 out of the total in that row, 44 out of 221. Which will be about 0.2, about 20%. And in the last row, the last conditional probability, in this last row, there's 29 yeses out of 205 total. So 29 out of 205. And that'll be about 0.1414. So those are your four conditional probabilities. Now the last question. Does knowing about the amount of thorny cover on a seedling change the probability of deer damage? So does knowing about the amount of thorny cover on a seedling change the probability of deer damage? Okay, so let's think about this logically. This is essentially saying that does having a thorny cover affect the amount of deer damage you're likely to have? Like, is there a different chance? Is there a different chance of you having deer damage if you have none, or less than a third, or if you have 1/3 or 2/3, or greater than 2/3? Like, does having a thorny cover affect your chance of getting deer damage? And logically in real life, it's kind of clear that it would, because it's going to scare deer away. So deer don't want to mess with that. But we just look at what we were doing. We were looking at the proportion of yeses in each row. And that's what we just calculated. The proportion of yeses, it was 0.28 at first, then 0.32, but it seemed to decrease. It went up at first. There's, again, not really a difference between these two. But then it went down to 0.2 and 0.14. So it seems, yes, that the more thorny cover that you have, the less likely you are to get deer damage. So we can say yes, because it seems that the more thorny cover you have, that's true. More thorny cover you have, the less likely you are to have deer damage. You are to have deer damage. You have deer. And there you go.